Okay, so we have here a veteran of this short series in the sense that Samantha Peet spoke at our conference last year, and a fascinating session at a time of immense worry and difficulty for professionals in relation to their PI policies. Samantha's day job, as she describes it, is Chief Executive of the Wren Insurance Association Limited. I don't know how long she's held that post, but I've known about the Wren for many years, a mutual insurer for architects, and she's been the chair of the CLC P2 group since May 2020. Lots of acronyms here. She's speaking to the topic doubled indemnity and an update on the financial challenges of insuring for professional liability. Why have premiums continued to rise? What can practices do to limit their exposure without abandoning work? Samantha, it's great to have you with us again. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's good to see you again. And I wish that I could tell you that this wasn't another year of immense worry and difficulty, as you explained it. But hopefully I can give some background and context to why we are still in difficult times, give you an update on what the CLC PII working group, so that's the Construction Leadership Council's Professional Indemnity Insurance Working Group, have been looking at in the last year. And I'll try and answer some of the questions that you have posed around why have premiums continued to rise, and what can people do to limit their exposure without abandoning work, and what steps can people take to get adequate PI insurance. So, as you said, I'm the chair of the Construction Leadership Council's Professional Indemnity Insurance Group, which was formed in May 2020. I think it was formed at the time to look at sort of COVID-19 issues in the way that trade credit insurance was being looked at that time. But it became apparent, as you'll know from my presentation last year, within the first 20 minutes of the first working group meeting, that no one was particularly worried about COVID-19 in the way that they were worried about professional indemnity insurance, the cost of the cover, and also the exclusions that were being put onto cover. And we have a really broad membership of the working group. So we have a number of construction professionals, we have brokers and insurers, and we have a number of people that represent trade associations. And we really do try to share the different perspectives that we're coming from to increase an understanding of why insurers are doing what they're doing, why construction professionals are doing what they're doing, and how they might come to a better relationship than they perhaps have at the moment. So just by way of background and what we talked about last year, the working group decided that it was no good meeting for once a month just to moan for an hour. That we could all quite easily do that, but actually what we needed to do was to come up with some solutions to the problems and some suggestions as to what needed to be done. And we very much felt that the insurance industry at that time was in a state of paralysis, and that it wasn't going to come out of that state of paralysis anytime soon. And we really did feel that there was a really strong argument for some government intervention, but we needed to have some data to support that. And what I mean by that is that what insurers were saying is, look, we were charging inadequate premiums for a number of years for the professional indemnity insurance cover that we've been providing you with. And even if Grenfell Tower had not happened, premiums had to go up because we just weren't bringing in enough premiums to cover the claims that came through. And then Once the Grenfell Tower tragedy happened, all insurers received a number of notifications that potentially were very expensive if they ultimately led to a paid claim for the cost of remediating cladding work. And as an insurer, you have to put reserves against claims that are made to you, and then you have to have capital that supports those reserves. And what the insurers were saying is, look, we've got a number of precautionary notifications. We have no idea what they're going to cost. We have no idea if they're going to crystallise. We don't know how bad the situation really is, but we're subject to financial regulation and we have to have a lot of reserves and capital against these. And in that context, we just can't take on any more risk. And so we need to put the premiums up, which we were going to have to do anyway. But we just can't take on any more fire risk exposure. So we're just going to put these exclusions onto professional indemnity insurance policies to protect our balance sheet. Now, that's all very well for insurers, and it's exactly what they should do, because insurers' primary responsibility is to make a profit for their shareholders. And so they shouldn't be writing business that is going to affect profitability and the interests of their shareholders. So the insurers were doing what they needed to do to protect their position. But of course, it left a number of construction professionals in this awful position of just having no cover for fire safety. And that made it very difficult for them to take on the necessary remedial work required to look at combustible cladding, but also any work. I think I may have said last year, I had somebody approach me and said, look, Samantha, we've got this small income stream where we maintain fire extinguishers, and we've now got this exclusion on our policy that says you've got no cover for anything related to fire safety. So we've just had to say to that client, sorry, we can't do that work anymore because we've got no professional indemnity insurance to support that work. So the implications went far beyond what the original problem was, which was the Grenfell Tower exposing the combustible cladding problem. So we carried out the survey in 2021 to try and bring in together enough data to show that we weren't just a group of whinging construction professionals, and that actually this was an issue that needed to be addressed, and we wanted to be able to go to government with hard data in order to ask for some support. And the findings of the survey in 2021 were as we would have expected. Although 2/3 of the respondents, and we had over 1,000 respondents, were earning less than 5% of their turnover from high-rise resi work, 29% were unable to buy the cover that they wanted or they needed. 74% of respondents had an excess level that was imposed upon them rather than the excess level that they would want to pay. Having said that, 64% were able to get an excess level that was less than 3% of their turnover. But 4% of the respondents had a claim excess that was at least 20% of their turnover. Importantly, 68% of respondents said they had restrictions on either the scope of cover or the level of cover for fire safety, and 31% said they lost jobs. Very few respondents had notifications at that time, but 71% had changed the nature of their work. So following that survey in 2021, we shared our findings with government, and government have always attended the CLC PII group meetings. And we argued that there should be fire safety cover underwritten by government, at least on remedial work, in order to allow work to happen, allow professionals to have the right cover that they needed in order to carry out this work. And our argument was that if you could get the remedial work done, you could sort out any professional indemnity claim issues arising from who was responsible for that work, and that would then crystallise and settle the claims that were sitting on the insurers' books. And it was only once the insurers didn't have these legacy claims sitting on their books that they would be able to start looking forward and taking risk on and dropping the restrictions in cover that they were putting on. We also argued to government that the proposed changes to the Defective Premises Act, extending the limitation period from 6 years to 30 years, was against building a good relationship with insurers, that insurers really wouldn't like this, and that it wasn't a good idea to take that action. Government have been really engaged with us on the working group, but they have at times been distracted. They were distracted by the EWS1 form issues that they had to deal with, and they didn't listen to what we said about the Defective Premises Act limitation period. They listened, but it was still extended to 30 years, which is a massive problem if you're an insurer. You're now facing claims today from work that was carried out under a strict liability basis up to 30 years ago. So we regrouped as a group. We carried on with our monthly meetings, and we said, look, all we can do really is carry out another survey to show that the situation hasn't changed, that we're still in this period of, as Paul calls it, immense worry and difficulty. So we carried out the survey again in 2022, largely the same participants by discipline and size and level of cover bought, and still very few doing high-rise resi. A slight improvement in the rate of being declined for cover and the ability to buy any one claim cover rather than aggregate cover, yet still 22% reported that they were unable to buy the cover that they wanted or needed. Still 73% had a level of excess that was imposed upon them rather than what they wanted. And but still 67% could get a claim excess less than 3% of turnover. But worryingly, 12% of respondents had a claim excess that was 20% of their turnover or more. And it was the SME respondents of average turnover of about 300,000 that were in that worryingly high claim excess as a percentage of turnover category. Still 68% said they had restrictions on either the scope or the level of cover for fire safety. Less of those were total restrictions, so a slight improvement. And still 24% had lost jobs. Fewer notifications, claims being reported, with only 3% of respondents saying they'd had claims paid, and yet still 70% had changed the nature of their work. So we had data, and in fact, we worked with government before putting together this second survey so that we could actually give them the anonymised data and they could actually model it and get far more information out of it than the sort of percentages that I've just given you. We shared that with government, and we're still in a very similar position. Anecdotally, there are some insurers that are starting to provide what I would call forward-facing cover. So you might not have a restriction for fire safety on the cover that you buy for work that you're doing from today and beyond, but you're still likely to have a restriction on your cover for any fire safety claims arising out of work that you've done in the past, unless you're a really large company who can use your premium leverage to get good terms with insurers over a long-term relationship. So what's next for the group? Obviously, we're looking at the Fire Safety Act, the Fire Safety Regulator. We're looking at the concept of the golden thread. I know that the RIBA have said that, you know, the golden thread is a good thing, that it puts the architect sort of front and centre of the design process. I have to say there are those that say that's fine if you're able to charge 10% fees and you like prison food, because the responsibility that comes with some of the obligations that we're looking at, we think are quite serious, and we think that there are amendments that would need to be made to the obligations and responsibilities that are coming out of the new legislation, if architects aren't to be left holding the baby and with all the liability. So we have, as a group, submitted comments through, government. What am I trying to say? Where government have asked for comments on new legislation, consultation processes. We've submitted our comments to that. We've been quite granular in some of the comments that we've made. For example, there is use of the word ensure in the draft Act, and if that is, I mean, and that's criminal liabilities coming out of the Act. But the reality is that clients are going to take that and want to put it into contractual documentation with architects and other design professionals. And if you put the word ensure into your contractual liabilities, I have to tell you that with most insurers, that is uninsurable. Because insurers only want to cover you to the extent that you would be liable in the absence of a contract, and they only want to insure you for having to show reasonable skill and care. And if you have a contract or appointment that says you will ensure something, that takes you beyond that, and it's beyond what your insurer wants to provide cover for. And it's particularly bad if you say you're going to ensure what somebody else does, because you've got even less chance of being able to do that. Some other things that are sort of hitting the radar. So the RIBA has reported a slump in workload. Professional indemnity insurance tends to be charged as a percentage of your income to your last completed financial year. So it's possible that we're going to have a number of construction professionals who are paying quite a lot of money for their professional indemnity insurance based on their last completed financial year turnover, but in a year where that turnover has fallen, and that makes the situation even worse in terms of the affordability of premiums. Premiums have continued to rise, and that's not just because insurers continue to worry about the risk exposure, but insurers are facing their own problems. They earn a lot of money from their investment income. It's part of the sort of the model of being an insurer, is that you earn money on the investment of the premiums that you are sitting on top of, and investments have performed really badly. For a number of reasons that we're all familiar with, but it does affect profitability for insurers, and it does mean that premiums have to be higher to make up for the fact that they're not earning enough money from their investments. They're also particularly worried about inflation. So if you're a professional indemnity insurer, then a number of your claims are for the cost of remedying a building, rebuilding a building, recladding a building. And the inflation on construction materials and all the supply chain problems that we're seeing means that there is an inflationary effect on claims cost, which again means that premiums have to go up in order to cover the expected increase in the cost of claims. Insurers, as I said, unhappy about limitation periods being changed to the Defective Premises Act, worried about the liabilities that are going to come through with the fire safety regulations. And I think really what's lacking is a sort of a central competency framework which would allow insurers to pick out the good eggs from the bad eggs, the well-run firms from the not so well-run firms. As Paul said, my day job is at Wren, and we have in-house architects who review the risk profile of our members in a lot of detail. Commercial market insurers don't have that kind of resource internally, so they don't have people that can give them comfort about how well run the practices that they're insuring are. And I do think that there is an argument for having some kind of competency framework that the construction industry could develop with insurers in order to give insurers the comfort that they're looking for about the risks that they're insuring. It'll be interesting to see how Building Safety Fund work is funded, whether there will be a number of jobs where the Building Safety Fund has been used to correct cladding with remedial works, but actually it's quite difficult to then prove that that cladding had to be removed and replaced because somebody was negligent. If it's been done because the owner of the property wants the building to comply with building regs in place today that weren't in place when the building was designed, I think there's going to be some real difficulties in actually getting contributions from others to the cost of that, because you won't be able to show that they've been negligent in the way that building has been designed and constructed. So it's possible that a number of these professional indemnity claims will just fall away, and that we will return to a new normal. But I have to say that the new normal would have to be premiums that are closer to what they are today than to the levels that they were at pre-Grenfell, because I think there is a general understanding that the premiums were too low, even if Grenfell hadn't happened. As I said earlier, there is some cover that is available, and there's a new IUA clause, International Underwriting Association clause, which encourages insurers to provide full fire safety cover for work done under the Building Safety Fund. Very quickly then, what can practices do to limit their exposure? There's some really good guidance out there, particularly some stuff that's come out from the ARB recently. I would encourage everybody to look at the papers that they have issued, particularly one, I think I've got it here, renewal advice on professional indemnity insurance. Some really good guidance on how to prepare properly for renewal and provide yourself or promote yourself in the best possible light as a risk to your insurers. But as far as the CLC PII working group is concerned, our efforts are going now to be on putting a paper together which we will submit to government, which will have some quite macro issues that we want to deal with around joint and several liability, the Building Safety Bill, the government support for the EWS1 scheme, and just really trying to reiterate that nothing seems to have moved quick enough to really help the SMEs, and our concern is that if action is not taken sooner rather than later, it will be the SMEs that will go out of business because they won't be able to afford their premiums, their claim excess, they'll have to turn down work, and they'll lose out to the big guns who have been able to buy the cover that they want or need. I'm conscious that's 20 past.
Yeah, am I on live? Right, good. So, well, not quite as good as Mary because you're 26 seconds over, not 7, but that's pretty fantastic timekeeping. A lot in there, and thank you for being so strict on your time because we've got a lot of questions. Some of which the sender won't be able to follow through on because Mark Taylor writes, "Thank you, Samantha, for such a detailed and knowledgeable presentation. I'm off to speak to my broker now, so we've lost him, he's already gone." But a lot in there. I have to say from the beginning, not only did I used to work as an insurance broker. When I left the Navy, before I went into architecture, I actually took a job with Cedric Forbes and was an insurance broker in aviation. So I sort of started to see the industry from that point of view. I've always found it a fascinating area, but my son is an underwriter at Lloyd's, so I get his stories. He's in marine shipping. And I think that the starting point I would wish to make is that insurance is not a charity, it's a business. And we jolly well need to understand it. It's also a partnership between the insurance company and the insured, often, perhaps usually through a broker, and the broker's role in it is absolutely critical. But we need to understand that our job is to protect the insurance company and all of our fellow professionals who are insured by ensuring that we don't get sued unnecessarily. And that brings me to ensure, insure, and assure. The Americans don't recognize those three words. They only recognize the insure. So you've got to be careful using the words. But you've got ensure. I'll ensure it'll happen. I'll insure against it happening. And I assure you it won't happen. And we need to be very much more careful as professionals, I think, in two areas. And I use the word professionals to cover all involved in construction. Even cladding subcontractors can be insured for their design work as well. And that is that we don't take on liabilities that we shouldn't. And we've got Andrew Saunderson of Field and Fisher speaking in a minute, and that'll be interesting to hear. But I think we need to look at the liabilities, and I'm talking about bespoke contracts. You know, when I was doing the Perth Stadium then in Australia, we had about 6 weeks of intense negotiations around the contract, which was 600 pages long. A bespoke contract of immense complexity. And so I think we should be careful about what we accept as liability, and we should look very hard at those contracts because they replace standard forms of appointments consistently. And I think the other thing is that we really should be careful to involve our brokers early and not just blindly accept responsibilities, but make sure that it is something which falls within our insurance policies, etc. But I suppose the starting one for questions with you would be, you talked about restricting liability. What about kickback on those appointment documents? And it's very difficult for architects at the beginning. I go to architects, they're starting a big project and suddenly they think, oh, I've got this huge contract in front of me. I now need a lawyer to look at it. There's another few £1,000s gone out before I blinked. How do we get to grips with those contracts at the early stage and reject what we shouldn't accept?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Paul. And again, with my day job hat on at Wren, we have 17 legally qualified people day in, day out, looking at the appointments between our architect members and their clients. And we get in excess of 30 new appointments a week to look at because we think that it's a very important risk management tool to look at the appointment between the architect and the client, to make sure that it's fair, but also to make sure that it falls within cover, and also to make sure that the services and the responsibilities matrix are reasonable and attainable. Now, commercial market insurers don't have those resources, and so they're only ever going to give you limited feedback on what they think about your appointment, and they're certainly not going to want to read 600-page appointments before they decide whether to provide cover or not. But you, as the insured,
If I may interrupt you there's a key point. The Wren are a great organisation, but I would say to everybody out there listening now, get yourself a good insurance policy with a good insurance company through a good insurance broker. You talk about the 600 pages. Actually, our broker, Alan Eyre, well known to you, I expect, he helped me all the way through that. And he didn't read the 600 pages, but what I could do is fire off to him sections of it. Because of course it all comes down to about 4 or 5 key points in the end, or 5 sections. And I would get answers within the 24-hour cycle. I think I couldn't advocate more strongly to listeners get yourself a good insurance company and a good broker, and there, through that, you will get good advice. I think that's right, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And the key thing, and I touched on it very briefly at the end of my presentation, we live in a world where you have joint and several liability with all other parties to the project, and that means that you might only be 1% liable for a claim, but you could end up paying 100% of the claim if nobody else is available to pay their fair share. And the only way that you can protect yourself against that is by having what's called a net contribution clause in your appointment. Now, it's in the standard RIBA appointment, and that's great. But more often than not, the bespoke appointments that you get through from the commercial clients will not have a net contribution clause in them, and it's very difficult to get them to agree to put a net contribution clause in
I'm
them.
right in thinking, aren't I, that the RBA contracts, appointments, they're only for middle and smaller jobs, because the bigger jobs almost always have bespoke appointment documents. Am I right or wrong on that? I think I'm right.
That's our
look,
experience.
you've got a map.
Yes.
You've got a map behind you, and there's pins all over the place. I can see Scandinavia, I can see Europe, and I can see Africa. There's not many down south, but there's plenty up north. Is that because you're insuring people from all over the world? I'll leave that. That's private business to you. But it does raise the question of decennial liability as well. Can you explain that very quickly to listeners? What is decennial liability? Who's going to be affected? Is it in the UK, or is it only in the abroad or in the Middle East? And what should they watch out for?
Yeah, so decennial insurance is not a specialism of mine, but as I understand it, you buy one policy that will cover 10 or 12 years worth of risk. And it tends to be popular, as you said, in the Middle East or in France, funnily enough. And it's a completely different way of looking at insurance, because you're not looking at an annually renewable policy where the terms and conditions can change and the premium can change year on year. You're buying one policy that's going to cover you for a long period of time. And so I would definitely echo your point that you need a good broker to explain to you the difference between a decennial insurance policy and a professional indemnity insurance policy. And you know, again, going back to your point, speak to your broker, speak to your insurers about what you're signing up to, but also be really robust with your clients and their lawyers. One of the arguments we often use is that there's no point clients and their solicitors insisting upon onerous clauses in the appointment if those fall outside insurance cover, because if what you're being asked to do falls outside of your insurance cover, when they come to claim against you, they're not going to be able to recover because you haven't got the money.
Right.
That's why you buy insurance.
So I can translate that, I think, and I don't mean to be rude to any delegates listening, but I think I can translate that into, you know, wake up and stay awake. This is important stuff. It's not just a thing that gets looked at every year. You need to be alive through the year in terms of looking after your reputation, looking after your policy and your insurer, and building up the kind of confidence in the relationship with the insurer that they're willing to see you through. Look, we've got another interesting question or point here from Andrew Fern. At what point do the insurer's coffers fill up sufficiently to cover all the policies? No, I'll leave that at the moment. He's saying, when are we going to get back to normal, which I think you've covered there earlier on, but that's a good point. I'd like to just throw one in here. Much of this has come across the back of cladding, but that got widened out to, well, we're not covering you for anything to do with fire. Well, since when did an architect have anything to do with designing a building that at some point didn't have something to do with fire? Means of escape, 2 staircases, fireman's lift, cladding, compartmentation. Fire is everywhere in the building, so you can't peel out fire. But it is interesting as well, I think, when you look at cladding. What is cladding? Do you have a view on that? It may be a difficult question for you, but I got asked that recently. And is brickwork cladding, was the question I was asked in a legal case. I can't go into any detail about that, but there's a question. What is cladding? Do you have a view on that?
Well, I do have a view, and we have a definition in again day job REN, where we talk about the external wall system, and we can go into what we mean by that. But the point is, unless you're a member of REN, it's of no consequence to you what my definition of cladding is. What's important is what is your insurer's definition of cladding, what is your insurer's definition of fire safety, and you need to understand that, so that you know what type of claim would be covered and what type of claim wouldn't be covered. And I see this from two perspectives. Just after Grenfell Tower, nothing much happened, but sort of April 2018, we started to see exclusions coming onto insurance policies, and they were quite specific. They would say, we will not cover you for claims where you have specified ACM cladding, because that's what the insurers were worried about. They wanted to shut the door on those claims and protect their balance sheet and protect their shareholders. But over a period of time, those exclusions became, we will not cover any claim directly or indirectly related to fire safety, which then covered absolutely anything, as you say. But if you speak to the insurers, they'll say that's because they started to get claim details through, and what was happening was the cladding was being taken off, and there were all sorts of problems around fire breaks and insulation and poor workmanship, poor design, such that they thought, oh my God, this isn't just the cladding that you stick on the outside. This is a mess, and this all needs to be replaced and remediated. And so again, in order to protect our balance sheet and our shareholders, we have to exclude cover for anything to do with any of this stuff. Now, the flip side to that is that if you're an architect or a construction professional, you're not designing cladding, you're not involved in high-rise resi, you still got stuck with this wide-ranging exclusion for fire safety, which then made it difficult for you to do a lot of other work. And that's where the disconnect has happened, I think.
So if I can translate that and then leave that point, it's be careful to limit your liability. If you're not designing the cladding, don't get involved in being responsible for the cladding, full stop, which architects need to be very careful about, because they may find that they pick up responsibility when that cladding comes back from the subcontractors as drawings to be checked and commented on. So you need to be careful there. Faye Ferguson says there's a widening gap between the PII offered to fire engineers compared to architects as a result of limited PII to fire engineers. Architects are having their responsibilities expanded. So that's a point I'll just leave with us all there. But I wanted to just go to the very last thing with you, because we're down to the last minute and a half. Number one, when you insure as an architect or as anybody, that insurance is for the year. So if it runs out at midnight on the 31st of October, at 1 second past midnight, you are no longer insured. So I just emphasize to everybody, don't let the insurance lapse, and give your brokers plenty of time to negotiate. So start your renewal if it's end of October during September or earlier. And the second one is, I'll leave it with you for a comment in the last few seconds, because you alluded to it earlier. We must be careful not to claim in our marketing that we have skills and knowledge that are beyond that which we are required to have under contract. We need reasonable skill and care and no more. So don't go promising lots more. Is that right?
Yes, don't overpromise and underperform.
Right. Well, there's a good note to end on. Look, thank you very much again. The time has absolutely whizzed by. It's lovely to see you again. And who knows, we may meet up again next year as well.